understanding the technology that powers the money is essential. Knowing the business drivers that inspire how the money is made is crucial. Bridging the gap between the mind of the technologist and the mind of the business is monumental. That is what TBF is all about. Let's start this never-ending conversation. It's time.
Happy Friday. Happy Friday. We are back with another episode of the Tech Behind FinTech. My name is Nnamdi Osuagu. I am your host. Joining me today is Stephen McKeon. We're going to really excited for today's episode about cybersecurity, finding the sweet spot for FinTechs. Mac, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for having me.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to get into Mac's extensive bio. There's a lot of great information to share today, and we're going to jump into it. Before I do, let me just do some housekeeping. We are streaming live from Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitch, and we have another stream going from Instagram. To all our viewers, always great to be with you guys on a Friday at 12 p.m. So let me get into Mac's bio, and then we will jump into today's episode. Stephen McKeon, or Mac, has been solving problems and voiding warranties since he was a kid. He has a natural curiosity for how things work and the bristles at inefficiencies. So the MacGyver nickname has followed him his whole life. He's the CEO of MacGuyverTech and MacNerd Enterprises, secure software development company specializing in building custom applications in the Web 2 and Web 3 space. He is a DJ, father, husband, son, brother, tech genius, and a giant nerd, and desperately wants to do good in the world. Love your bio, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Hey, the world needs more light. Yeah, so I'm hopefully bringing some of that to this world.
All right, cool. So today's episode, want to give and dive into cybersecurity, finding that sweet spot for FinTechs. As we know, right, cybersecurity is a pressing issue. Everyone's not only talking about it, experiencing in some way, shape, or form, especially the FinTech side. But for startups alike, the budget can be really, really slim, but they still have to get stuff done. So we want to kind of go through today's episode and look for the sweet spot, talk about some potential frameworks and things they can do to increase their cybersecurity awareness, one, harden their posture, harden their infrastructure, and so forth, and get a really stable posture. So initially, Matt, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's a great question for sure. I mean, there's a lot of small business out there that is trying to get work done, but they're not understanding that there's a lot of bad guys that are trying to take advantage of them. You know, some of the things I see out there, you know, just in my personal travels as an ethical hacker and trying to help people, that there's just a lot of, uncertainty, a lot of, some technical things and jargons thrown around. You hear things like MFA and pen testing and, maybe I need a cyber insurance policy and not really sure what that means and how that works. And as a small business, you're like, whoa, I already got a lot going on. This could be a cost center. So they're just trying to make sure they're secure enough to get by. But, maybe they need to kind of have somebody to kind of help them to make sure they're making the right decisions. So simple things like this enabling MFA, which is not going to cost anybody anything. And MFA means multiple form authentication. And, what it means is like, if you're going to log into like your email, you might have an app on your phone that gives you a code so you can log in and make it sure that you're that person that's supposed to log in, that somebody trying to impersonate you, or maybe your credentials were stolen online through some of the dark web stuff and bad hackers that are trying to take that information. So those are the types of things that kind of jump out at me right away that might be helpful.
I mean, that's a good point you make. I mean, some of these things are low-hanging fruit. Like, we're in the industry, we know, like MFA is pretty much standard, but when you just are using, a password per se and not a secondary form of identification or authentication, and someone gets access to that password, or they do some sort of credential stuffing, going around testing on different platforms, and they gain access. Real simple solution to look at it. And when you say MFA, we're thinking about what comes to mind is like security in depth and having multiple layers of security before someone getting into the crown jewels. So let's take it a step back, right?
Sure.
Let's take it from two angles, because we're really gonna, based on Mac's experience, we can really just go in different directions. But let's say that we're going to talk about the startup that didn't think about security initially, right? I think this is a great angle, right? Let's talk about the startup that didn't think about security initially. They thought about, we have to build this product, we got the investment funds, and we have to bring it out. Now that they're close to production or in production, their investors and their board, like, what about security? So now they're circling back and thinking about how to harden this environment. What are some of the steps that they can do at that end?
I mean, bare minimum, you should have a second set of eyes, another company that is technical, that understands, like maybe a software developer or a cyber company, to kind of look at what your project is from a technical standpoint, from the, what servers it's running, and also the code. Because in my world, in software, there's a million ways to build an application, but there's probably only 2 or 3 good ones that are secure enough to be resilient in this world that we live in. As soon as you put a website up, you're going to have the hackers trying to take advantage of it. And you'll have hundreds, if not thousands, of those attempts a day. There's a lot of bots scanning for people being lazy, not following any, policies that might be keeping them secure. And next thing you know, they're in and they take advantage of it. And these are the things that, as a small startup, the budgets are tight and they don't really have a lot of wiggle room. Taking a financial hit, something like this, could just close the doors immediately. And that's nothing. You got to really take security seriously these days. And having, the investors are going to want to know, is my dev team and my CTO actually as good as they are? Are they thinking about security? And having somebody to kind of bounce off there to get that validation, maybe by, doing some simple penetration testing or vulnerability assessments of what the outside world's seeing of what your application is essential. And those can also have some low-lying fruit where it's just maybe a misconfiguration of a server or some code, and they can be solved really quickly. But if you don't have eyes and ears on that, how do you even know? And that's something to think about.
I mean, that's definitely a good point. So what we're saying is, at this stage, I think okay, I'm sorry about that, guys. I'm streaming live from another section. Just pause, but it's back. So, we're trying to have multiple streams.
You're a popular guy, huh?
I'm trying to, broaden the show's reach. So, but good point that you made. So these guys are in production. You recommend, all right, let work with a penetration testing company. Let's start kind of seeing what potential vulnerabilities that you have. And let's start doing a remediation plan for it.
Absolutely. Another thing is the cyber insurance companies are really starting to type up things now. So, I mean, most companies, you're going to have to, even me as a business, I have all types of insurances, from general liability to E&O. And now cyber insurance is one of those kind of buckets you have to fill if you're going to be doing business in any way that's secure. That gives you a safety net to at least, say, if something did happen from a financial standpoint, they can cover you. But that doesn't always happen, because if you don't actually do penetration tests or even have MFA and enabled on your stuff, and you have the insurance, and then something happens, and then you're not following certain procedures of doing stuff to at least secure your kind of walled garden of what your application is, they're going to deny you. So you got to be careful of just thinking, hey, I got the insurance policy, I'm covered. You actually have to do your due diligence to prove that you actually are securing your environment.
I mean, and that's a very important point. A lot of people would think, well, I have insurance, he'll pay for it. But then the insurance company comes back and says, well, part of the fine lines, if you look at the terms of agreement, you have to have some sort of minimum state security. So what are you abiding to? And that's when, in this conversation, I'm thinking frameworks are really good. I know in FinTech, SOC 2, type 2, that's like a golden standard among partners and different when you start, especially B2B businesses. But let's say, and that requires an external auditor and so forth. But let's say that you wanted to start with NIST or so forth, having a framework in place that you can follow. So it's somewhat prescriptive, saying, okay, have you covered these items, right? Once again, this is for the startup that didn't really think about security initially, right? And then the next topic we can kind of go into, brand new startup, and now they're thinking about, okay, what can we do for security and basically secure by design. That's a whole conversation. I want to pick your brain because I know you specialize on the software side.
I do.
But with the one that's currently in production, we have pen testing, number one, right? We also have a framework, like whether it might be too intense for them initially to go for the SOC 2, it could be overwhelming. But what about a NIST framework? Or there's tons of different frameworks out, but the general consensus with these frameworks is that it basically gives you a real good view of cybersecurity protocols that have been tested, so you can use it to generate policies and so forth. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
I agree with you 100% on there. And SOC 2 might be a little overwhelming, especially for a startup. But there's even simpler things. Honestly, the funny thing is, in cybersecurity world, the biggest problem is not the technology, it's the people. You know what I mean? It's actually just having, training your staff to be vigilant and looking out for malicious emails and phishing scams that are looking to get into your network. And all they have to do is click that button once and it's game over. And, or you got people impersonating and maybe changing the domain letters of your name and impersonating your employee and saying, hey, by the way, we changed banks and here's the wire information. And you might just be duped really quickly. Next thing you know, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars drained out of your business account. And these are things that happen every day, all the time. And until it happens to you, you don't really take security seriously. I like to educate people to actually be more proactive in that area and not say, hey, I'm only a small company. Who cares about me? Nobody's going to hack me because I'm not a target. But that's actually not the case. You're actually an easier target. The enterprise applications or the companies that are out there already have good defenses. They have budgets. They have CISOs. They have the right people in the places to really put up a good defense. But the mid-market and smaller companies, they don't have access to those tools, at least not yet. And, they know, the hackers know they can take advantage of a small company really easy because they don't have somebody, looking over stuff. They might maybe have a CTO, but that CTO is very technical, but he's not a security-focused mindset where you maybe need a CISO or somebody that really understands security and how the hackers think and work. And then that is kind of where I see a lot of people get in trouble, in that area. So I'd love to see what your thoughts on that.
So I like it. I want to circle back to what you said in terms of training and security awareness, right? Because your biggest threat are your internal people. We're not even, and let's differentiate, right? We're not talking necessarily about insider threat where an employee maliciously is trying to take advantage and scam his employer. We're just talking about pure negligence or a lack of understanding. So you mentioned phishing emails in which, they're getting these emails and they're just clicking away on random links and downloading malware, right? But then there's also business email compromise where it's like, listen, I have this invoice that needs to be paid. It's from one of our trusted vendors. And without having the right policies or protocols in place, someone's now sending another company $50K, right? So, I think that's extremely important to really drill in, because I like that you brought that up. And, a lot of those small companies, the training aspect, I think, is missing at times, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Because some people will look at it like it seems like common sense, right? Like, oh no,
it does, but we're emotional. You're emotional creatures, not logical creatures. So that's where the problem is. Most people think with emotions, and you're going through your day at business and you might be distracted. Somebody might be telling you a joke on the side and you just kind of somewhat looking at your emails and like, oh, that's somewhat looking at, left hand on your side of your screen. And you're like, oh, that looks like somebody click. Next thing you know, oh my God, I clicked on the wrong one. That domain name was off by a letter, but they were impersonating somebody that was maybe on vacation or out, or they maybe were traveling and their laptop got compromised in the Wi-Fi's. And, a lot of people don't realize, like when you travel, there's a lot of hackers that are roaming around in airports creating fake Wi-Fi's. And next thing you know, you're connecting, try to go to your office, connecting, they're seeing everything you see. Next thing you know, that person's compromised and then they get into your company and try to take advantage of that in any way they can. A lot of these hackers are not just kind of like, people think when they get hacked, that's when the hacker is going to take action. It's actually not the case. A hacker's going to go in and lay dormant and learn and understand when is the best time in the press to actually take advantage of you. Case in point, I'm working with a company right now. This person was out of work, laid up because she was injured. That person email was compromised or taking advantage of, and that they were trying to use that to kind of work their way through and say, hey, by the way, could you, we changed over some stuff and here, blah, 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 here's some information and please send it to here. Thank God they were smart enough to look at the domain name. It was like one letter off. They switched the letters and it was really hard to look at unless you really looked at it, because a lot of people use Outlook and email applications where it doesn't always show you the email. It shows you the person's name and you have to hover over it and look at that. And a lot of people don't take that extra step to actually, don't trust anything coming in. Let me just kind of double check that. Or, if you're unsure, always get a second set of eyes before you click on it, because once you click on it, you can't go back.
So I mean, I like that, and there's and this is once again for the like as Mac mentioned, right? You don't have the budget, maybe you don't have that head of security or CISO involved, and you're basically using all of these different, going about it yourself. A few things that I want to touch on that you said. I I I, I like the idea, the training. Actually, we're covering that, and when someone's out. No, this is what I wanted to talk about. You talked about traveling. So what I see with that is more of a risk-based profile. So if you look at your organization, the different activities that you do, you can kind of start to understand, okay, what are my potential risks here? So let's say that you have a sales person in your organization, or even it could be your CEO. Sometimes they're the best salespeople. They travel a lot. So it's now understanding, okay, this person travels a lot from a security perspective. What are the different risks? Mac mentioned you're in the airport, you're connected to different Wi-Fi. So that person may need their own VPN now. So we start looking at this. So we look at the profile, and we look at the different risks associated with that profile. Then we start putting security gates along each path. That's a real straightforward way to start hardening your situation. You have a comment from the audience? We'd like to get
Sure.
So Sarah said exactly to one of the comments that we made. Definitely, Sarah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the comments. We appreciate all comments from the audience. Any questions, comments, please feel free to engage. Appreciate you, Sarah.
Excellent. Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that? Like in terms of establishing, the risk involved with the organization. Like once again, this is for a small company to try to understand, and we can't secure everything, but where do most of our risk lie? How would they go about doing?
Sure. I mean, one thing is have a standard operating procedure of how you're going to handle people that are leaving the office and what the things going through, and maybe just doing a quick. Most of this is this process based, and that's what's really helpful in this area from a small company. It's not you have to spend all this money on tech to say I'm secure. It's really process and people, and then getting them to kind of work in a certain way that if you do it this way, you can kind of control the process. And then let's say that person went out to Vegas, brought the laptop, and then they maybe got compromised. Expect and treat that laptop coming back as it was compromised. And how would you handle that? Like maybe have a little bit of auditing of something like that. Maybe have some software that's fairly inexpensive, if not free, to track what's going on. You can probably just change a couple things in the Windows settings or a Mac to track and have logs of what's going on there. And then basically have that audited afterward by somebody technical on your staff and to make sure it's kind of in a good place. Have them using a VPN. So even if they did connect to a malicious Wi-Fi, their traffic's encrypted and through a tunnel where they can't really see that information. Just simple things like that. And the VPNs are, $5, $10 a month kind of thing, up to more expensive ones. But that's pretty easy kind of ways of kind of soften it. Don't trust any public Wi-Fis. There's always a cost. Nothing's free. And that's one way I try to look at that. Don't even though it's a free Wi-Fi, most people have 5G on their phone. And they can just kind of walk around and use that for most times, even though it might not be the most ideal, it'd be more secure, especially when you're traveling abroad or remotely. And
these are all important points, especially for like companies like that are always on the road, work in a very remote environment right now. So a lot of people technically could work from home, but they might be working from a vacation spot or visiting or just on the road. So I think that's a very important point you brought up, Mac. I wanted to touch base on what you said, but let's drill in on it. SOPs and how important they are, right? Standard operating procedures. So, and what you said about the response. And also, it's a point that you brought up. Sometimes where when you get compromised and they're lurking, I think the average time before an organization realizes they were compromised is 200 days.
At least.
I read that stat somewhere. I think it was Panama or something like that. It's at least like 200 days. And that means, to what Max said earlier, right? This threat actor is literally in your environment, laying dormant, waiting, collecting information, making lateral moves, doing additional reconnaissance, gathering more information, seeing how they can increase their level of privilege and so forth. So 200 days, I mean, that's close to
considerable. That's considerable time for a lot can happen in that time. And that's the average, right? I mean, some people might be compromised, for a year or two and, don't realize it. Next thing you know, they they realize that you got some kind of big deal going on, and then they're going to try to, take advantage of that. And I've seen that happen too. I've seen it like in M&As as a big example, especially when there's a lot of movement around, when a company is going to acquire another company, a lot of people are throwing information around from two different companies. That could create a lot of noise, and that noise attracts undesirables that are going to look to take advantage of. I already saw one company that were in the middle of M&A, and the guy got a fake email, and then he's like, oh, here's the wire transfer for a thing. Like, they knew exactly when and where to plant that, fake email to take action. And unfortunately for that company, they lost quite a bit of money, and they sent it to the wrong bank, the hacker's bank. And it's because they sat and waited and learned about what the best opportunity was to kind of take advantage of you.
Yeah, I like to explore that use case. So I like it. So because it even happens with these startups because they're partnered with larger institutional banks, or they get potentially getting acquired and so forth. So with that use case that you just mentioned, this threat actor sat for more than a year gathering information, gathering intel, and then during the M&A process, they basically then use some sort of business email compromise tactic and then had the money routed somewhere else.
Yep.
Wow.
That's pretty scary, isn't it? And you
really
think you're going through a whole business thing, it's great and everybody's great, but there's so much churn. You got lawyers involved. You got a lot of vectors for somebody to find out information, between third parties and the companies that are actually involved. And there's also corporate espionage too, so that's also like, there's a lot of, that's a very risky time for companies, and you got to be very vigilant and be really sealed up on that and make sure your security is really top notch, because if not, you could be one of the victims that unfortunately I helped in the past that ran into this type of situation.
Wow. So, we just talked about, a company that's currently in production. This is something I think we both going to have fun in because you're passionate about software security. So am I. Let's talk about that startup who says, you know what? We listened to the tech behind FinTech. We heard Nnamdi and Mac talking. We're about to build something. So listen, we want to start security early in our process. I think the term is secure by design. So we want to now start embedding security in our process. If we take it from software, let's give some nuggets that people can use.
Sure. Yeah, no, from the software side is a lot of, like I was mentioning, I think earlier, there's a lot of ways to build an application, but a lot of companies, especially they're bootstrapping and startups, are just trying to get that MVP out the door. Security is like a last thought that they're going to slap in a plug-in or try to apply something at the last minute. Unfortunately, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, you got to do security by design. You got to bake that into the beginning of the process and understand how, like, their user authentication, make sure the app has MFA enabled, make sure it does it in a secure way that somebody can't take advantage of it or have any leaked information out of the application. There's a lot of moving parts, especially when it comes to like a SaaS company, because what I've seen a lot with these SaaS companies is, they'll make their MVP, but that MVP will have to keep moving as the SaaS product's always in constant development. So we could be secure today, and then the developers make a couple changes, and then next thing you know, they get hacked because they made a change that weren't really thinking about the security implications of what could happen. So rigorously running your stuff through penetration tests, vulnerability assessments are essential for those types of products if you really want to be secure, because it only takes one little, and developers are lazy. I'm a developer. I have 25 years experience, so I know how developers think. I'm one of them myself, and they don't like to comment. They don't like to they just want to get this stuff done. And in my world, a lot of developers are told what to do. Here's the box, make the box. But the person running it might not understand, like, hey, there's some security implications to this. Am I doing this properly? Best thing a developer could do if they have some security knowledge should raise their hand and say, hey, you know what? I know you told me to do this, but there might be a problem here from like an SQL injection attack. And I think we should take the appropriate, security measures to make sure this is secure. And just having those honest conversations during the development process could really solve some of these problems. Because, I know everybody's running around and nobody wants to take the time to do that, but just slowing it down just for a little bit, just to make sure before you kind of push that button, you push it out to production, that it is really hardened against the bad guys. I mean, think about you're going out into a firestorm. That's why they call things like firewalls, because you're going out into a very toxic landscape on the internet. And unfortunately, there's a lot of stake actors like Russia and China that are doing nothing but trying to take advantage of American companies. And we see this a lot. We're actually an active member of the FBI InfoGuard, and we have an obligation to protect American infrastructure. And there is a lot of activity as of recently, and much more than I've ever seen. So you got to be vigilant, and you got to make sure you take those, security precautions to make sure if you're going to put it out there, make sure it has a good enough defense to survive.
And all important points that Matt brought up, for sure. And I want to add into that concept of continuous integration, continuous deployment. So a lot of startups talk about that in DevOps, and they talk about rapid deployments and constant releasing. You can, in the same breath, right, add security tests to your CI/CD pipeline. And what that does, it gives you the information early and often. And before we even get into that, right, if we're talking about architecture, something that I think gets missed a lot is threat modeling, right? So you have this massive backlog, and let's talk about. Backlog is more agile terms, but startups are familiar because this is the laundry list of items that you want to do to release. What I see missing sometimes during that threat modeling exercise, adding security requirements to that backlog so it doesn't get missed. Real simple, right? Because sometimes they talk about security, but when it's not part of the backlog and part of your sprints that you're releasing, it gets lost by the wayside. Have you seen examples like that?
And there's just, let me be clear too. A lot of these tools, like the static code analysis tools, most of them are open source and free. You just have to know how to take advantage of them. Most developers are usually comfortable working in an open source environment. I know I am. And there's just plethora of tools out there. You just have to know where to look. And that alone, I just went through a project that was a Ruby project, and it had, the developer's like, oh, I think we're okay. It had 51 high vulnerabilities, and it had SQL injection attacks. And all I did is run it through a static code analysis, and I saw, oh my God, immediately jumped out. Now we have to go dive deeper and help them remediate some of these things. But those are types of things you can build right into the CI/CD pipeline. As one thing we do is during, there's a thing called source control, or GitHub, most people know it as. When you hit that commit button to push your code up to there, you can run these processes and deny them from committing the code unless it passes security checks and certain parameters or coding standards. Like, it will reject you and prevent you from even pushing that out. And that's a simple little kind of gatekeeper that, it'll just protect you from allowing people from putting bad things out there.
I like that you brought that up, and that's free, right? That's just about enabling it. A lot of companies, especially if you look at the management side, maybe they're not, like you said, the developer, they're thinking about, they have a list of requirements, they have to get this stuff out, but no one's there to basically say, okay, why not enable this? What is your security practices? I would even say earlier on, we talked about training, but talked about training with employee staff. There's more highly technical security development training that developers should take. This way they could kind of understand this stuff while they're developing and writing code. You brought up GitHub. Something that I personally like is GitHub Actions, because you can automate a lot of your security. You can automate anything through it, right? But it's part of GitHub, but you can add that to you can bolt that on. And as Mac mentioned, you can connect it to some open source tools that you can now leverage. All right, we have looking at it from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
This is threat modeling. They added the CI/CD pipeline. To Mac's point, they did vulnerability testing. They're adding, in development tests like static code, dynamic code analysis. Looking at it now, right? Most of these startups are going to deploy something to the cloud. So what are the practices there? Give some insight on that.
Yeah, the clouds are a whole different animal too. Most, the cloud started out, and I've been old enough. I started with AWS when it first started. Just getting virtual servers and having it out in the cloud. But now it's much more sophisticated. You have things like Docker, and you mentioned in CI/CD pipelines, where that developer commits the code, automatically gets pushed up. They build a Docker image, then it gets pushed up to the production server that kind of controls how they kind of run. And that process should be pretty locked down. You should have, your firewall set up, and that firewall should have some redundancy. And also, it's not a bad idea to geofence your application, meaning that, like, say, if you're not expecting any users from China, block them, block that whole entire country. Our company itself, we dealt with this with some employees, because one of the big things happening now is there's an exploit we got through the FBI InfoGuard. It's called China's living off the land. And what they're doing is they're having Chinese citizens come in America, or basically try to get hired at American companies, but they're really working for China, and they're trying to get insider access to companies and then send that back over. And how we found this out, we had 2 of these instances happen, because we have a good reputation, and we put out resume requests, and we get a good amount of them back. Some of these people are really talented and sharp, but what we do is we geofence our whole entire network. So basically only America and Canada is allowed to even see us. So when I see, a new employee, let's say, kind of to get hired, and then say, hey, I'm having trouble accessing your network, but they're supposed to be in Canada, and then we find out they're in Hong Kong, that's a problem. But that's a lot of people aren't even geofencing their stuff. You wouldn't even find that out unless you kind of geofence it. And geofence is a term meaning that, hey, in your IP address where you're coming from and accessing the internet, it's giving an IP address that's tied to the location on the planet where you are. And I can tell you if you're in Canada, US, in China. And when you kind of lock down your firewall, you can say, okay, deny all traffic except for certain countries and certain regions of the world. And that alone, it saved our butt twice internally. So those are types of things that are not, they don't cost anything. These are just configurations of your firewall and your networks.
I mean, that's interesting. So I've used it, the geofencing. I wasn't even thinking about the term. I just did it. But for more so, but on the other end, for like websites, and let's say if I know this website, like there's no way you're gonna have a random customer from Uzbekistan. So it's just like,
right, yeah, I totally
cut that off immediately, because that's not where our customer base is. But you're talking about geofence differently. You're talking differently from how I used it. You're talking more about from employees accessing your network.
Absolutely, that's a problem. Yeah, like especially a startup might be just looking for somebody on Fiverr, and they don't know what they're getting into. And next thing you know, they're trying to cipher everything. If you hired somebody that's working for a government that's not friendly to America, and they're just trying to get inside your company and take advantage of everything, I mean, it's game over, because what's going to happen? He's going to bring his buddies in. He's going to install rats or remote access terminals and malware on your network to kind of track what you're doing without your knowledge, especially if you got administrative access. So be very careful of the new hires you bring in, and make sure you kind of don't ever give them elevated privileges to start with. Also make sure you look at where they're actually, are they saying where they are from? Because, the world's changed since COVID. It's a big remote workforce, and most people are now having these people all over the world in different places and with different types of level of security on their home laptop compared to what their office is. There's no standardization. So what that opens up is a lot of vectors of places for people to kind of take advantage of that. So that's something, I see.
And I think this is a good point, right? Because, when you're at a startup side nature, you're using a limited amount of resources, you're outsourcing a lot. So you could be working with a remote team, or remote in a sense of internationally remote team, right? So one of the jewels that I'm getting from what you're saying is, okay, if I know I'm working with someone in India or Nigeria or South Africa, then those are the people I'm letting in. But anyone else outside of these random other countries, no, you can't come in. So I think that's an excellent tip.
I'm invisible. Like if China comes in, I'm invisible. They don't even see me. Because because I am an ethical hacker, so I do a rude thing called black holing any traffic for those. And so what that means is, there's when you do a response to a server, you kind of see if it's alive or not. Geofencing is going to maybe stop that traffic. You might get a ping or a request back, but black holing it, I just take the traffic and it never leaves. So for their standpoint, I'm offline. And these are, and like I said, these are all just configurations. These are not cost centers. They're just, if somebody's technical enough, knows how to run the firewall and your infrastructure, that's the person to do it. And if you don't, look for somebody that's a CISO like yourself and understands what the security policies might be, and get somebody, if you're not sure, you can reach out to me and others. There's a lot of people that really care about security and doing the right thing here. You sometimes just have to raise your hand and ask around. Don't be ashamed to do that, especially as a new company.
And also, I want to mention what Max said about the reason to talk about China, right? Like we're talking, it's a term called nation state actors. So 100%. That's when it's not necessarily driven by criminal enterprises. It's more so driven or backed by the government itself. And historically, that's along with other countries, there are certain nation state actors against America. And that's like really, really sophisticated exploits that they do. That's like that literally kind of scopes beyond the budget of your average startup. So I think it's a good point with Mac is saying, is like, you know what, instead of trying to fight these guys, we're just going to block them entirely. Like, why go through the fight? We don't have the resources, because when you are being attacked by a nation state, they have extensive resources that most average companies just don't have. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and let me be clear about that. So most people think of a hacker and the bad guy as, some really smart guy living in his mom's basement playing video games. That's not the case with China and Russia. They literally have thousands of people in a room working together in a unit to compromise targets. And they're going after large companies. Like my wife works for Boeing. Boeing's been compromised. And what they're doing is they're going into those companies and not just copying information. They're changing the tolerances on the bolts and the plans of how to make the planes. So when we go to war, those planes fall out of the sky. That's the level of insidious attacks they're doing. So, and that's just a large company like Boeing. Because imagine what they're doing to small companies that don't have defenses like a company like Boeing. Those types of things have been found and kind of stomped out. But it's constant, and it's only increasing in that activity. So it's kind of a scary time to be online. You got to be security is not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity, and you have to take it seriously.
We have a comment from the audience. So one of our viewers, Jeff Martin, he has we always shout him out. He's one of our most loyal viewers. Happy Fridays, Jeff. LinkedIn Live's working. Okay, geofencing is needed with remote work. One difficulty is that not everyone reports when they leave the U.S. That's a great point.
Sure, but you can basically make sure you are in contact with that person. If they're traveling to other locations, you can allow them to go through. Or what we do is we have them go through a VPN and kind of hop to a location to hop to us. So, they're not kind of like, we can force them to go through a certain path. I don't want to get too technical, but there's ways of working around that.
And this follow-up question, should the help desk be included with geofencing alert? Should a device be warranted outside the geofence?
I think so. And then that's an easy way for the help desk to understand, hey, maybe we have an employee that's maybe traveling outside the zone. We need to maybe take some action to allow them or deny them. Just being proactive.
And I will harp back on what we said earlier, right? Less about geofencing and more about policies. What are your standard operating procedures? What policies do you follow? Because now if you have those in place, then those types of rule sets is like, you know what? If we do this, then this happens.
Exactly.
And it really boils down to, I think frameworks and policies are really the backbone to really understand it, because, from the top of we both have obviously cybersecurity experience and various certs and whatever, but sometimes from the top of my head, I'm going to remember what I remember. But if I have a framework, okay, yeah, you have to do this. This is a good kind of a checklist to abide by and say, okay, what are the main risks necessary in my organization? Because you might not be able to cover the entire gambit, but if you can say, what are the biggest risks of my organizations? Now, in looking at this framework, what can I leverage here? It's almost like a guideline.
Right. I have a question, because I know we mentioned SOC and NIST, but what are your thoughts on CMMC, or Cybersecurity Readiness Model, that our government is instantiating right now? And it's a framework for security, especially for the DoD it's starting at. And it's allowing, basically, it's a framework, a pretty sophisticated framework to basically, for the longest time, we haven't taken security seriously here in America. Our government's finally starting to catch on, and now we have a good framework it takes it to another level than SOC. But what are your thoughts about that? Because that's right now being impacted by the DoD, and I assume in the future that's going to hit the commercial space, and that is a pretty rigorous framework of how to actually be secure, and not all of it's technical. There's a lot of policies and procedures and how your staff handles certain types of things. I'd love to hear your feedback on that, because it's something a little bit newer than some of the other things we chatted about.
If I'm not familiar, last time I checked on that, that's more so for like government contractors. Like if I'm going to do business with the government, there's certain frameworks I have to abide by. From my recollection, when I was looking into it, CMC was part of that. I know there's a big push to get a lot of people that do business with the government, businesses like that, to say, okay, you know what, are you CMCC compliant? Is that accurate?
CMC 1 and 2 now. So yes, so in the next few months, I believe the government will start denying contractors or companies that are not CMC certified.
So, you know, I primarily work in the private sector.
Okay.
And, you know, my thoughts on it. So I look at frameworks that kind of more so are for the private sector. So like, I know for like FinTechs and so forth, SOC 2, Type 2, that's like the golden standard.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And then if you don't necessarily have that, I mean, there's various like there's NIST, CSF, there's just basic ones to just give you a good pathway. But Absolutely. Then if you want to work with it, so my thing on it, look, I think in general, I'm a framework fan. Like I'm gonna say
Same here.
Because what it does is, you know, like I said earlier, right? We took certifications, all this stuff, but who remembers all this stuff? If I can have like, this is the guideline, and here are the different things that I can work with. That's what a framework gives you. It gives you it. It was a good analogy I heard. It was a really awesome analogy, actually. They said if you look at it like a building, right, and you have architectural plans and so forth, what the frameworks are like guidelines when you're building, and say, you know what, can't do this. No, this wall has to have a certain height. That's what the security to me framework is, when leveraging it to do that, right? So you have all these guidelines and things of that nature. That, you know, I may be specialized in software security. I might not be as strong in one subject area, but the framework kind of says, you know what, here are the things you have to think about in this particular area. So in terms of, to answer your question, I think it's good for contractors. I wouldn't look at it right now for the private sector.
Yeah, it might be a year or two out. Yeah. So,
but definitely, look, like I said, I'm a fan in general of it, and I think the framework that pertains to your business, that your industry is looks at, I think that's the one that you should focus on initially. I know from a government contractor side, CMC, like Mac just said, look, it's becoming the standard. You have to do it, or you're not going to do business with the government. For FinTechs, it's SOC 2. Like a lot of when you start going for partner deals or going for a certain B2B business, the first question they ask them to due diligence: are you SOC 2 compliant? Absolutely. Or how far along are you? How do you think? Because it just helps them gauge where you are at. So they don't have to ask you. They're still going to ask you 1,000 questions, but they can easily say, you know what, this guy's off the list. He doesn't have it. Okay, who's the next person? What's on it?
I think what it really does, it really creates, you know, like the framework and the process, and it takes the thought process out of it. It's already out of your hands. You don't have to keep it in your head and forget things. I have ADHD, so I kind of like forget things easily. But you know, it's kind of good for me because then I have a playbook. I mean, just thinking about, I'm a big sports person, and under the Lakers back when they had the dream team, it's about trusting the process. You know, initially, I think when I forget what their famous coach did. You know, they got all these superstars, but they sucked that year. But then he went and created a process, and it made everybody work in this process and framework. And next year, within 8 months, they were national champs for the next year or two. You know, and that's because they followed a process and a framework, and they took the thought process out of the players, and then they work together as a unit. And that's what in some ways, a company is a team. It's almost like a sports team. You have to have the right people in the right seats, and they also have to work together. So having that framework has everybody playing on that same playbook.
Oh, absolutely. At this point of the show, we have to take a moment for our sponsors, and we'll be back literally in 1 minute.
Excellent.
Are you an emerging fintech with a limited budget seeking more sales and partners? Introducing Strategic Generation, your partner in leveraging cybersecurity for sales and partner enablement. Fintechs often lose opportunities due to unsophisticated cybersecurity programs. That's where we come in. Strategic Generation assists with due diligence, security posture visibility, penetration testing, and on-demand virtual CISO services. We connect your systems to our partnered platform, and voila! Instant access to real-time diagnostics and compliance frameworks such as SOC 2 and PCI DSS. Gain the confidence of prospects and partners. Strengthen your cybersecurity program and drive success. Stop losing deals due to cybersecurity. Visit strategicgeneration.com and click on Demand CISO to connect with an expert.
To our episode after that movement from our sponsors. All right, so Matt, I absolutely love this show. It's rare that I can just get on and we could just talk shop. I kind of like it.
I feel we can talk all day.
Yeah, of course. I really dig it, and also giving some ideas to some of these companies. It's a shame. It's like you're building a great product, right? You're going to give an extreme amount of value to your customers or to the industry. But now you get stifled by cybersecurity that could just totally impact that. So, not having this in place actually is a detriment, not only to you, but to your potential prospects and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as risk aversion, and that's something to keep in mind. It's not, what is your risk tolerance? I mean, if you're super high risky, go for it. But if you want to stay in business for a while, you might want to kind of take some of these things and imply them. And like we were saying, it's a lot of the stuff doesn't cost. There's a lot of low-lying fruit, and you just have to really pay attention, put some processes in place, put the right people looking at the right things. And if you're unsure, make sure you reach out to the people that can actually point you in the right direction so you don't have that uh-oh moment. And, the last thing you want to do is, a lot of people don't realize it's not just the initial hack that causes a lot of the damage. It's the collateral damage afterwards, because these hackers are not just going in and trying to take money from you. It's the data that's important too. All your customers' information. And next thing, they'll get compromised. It's like a spider web, and they go on to the next one. And then you could cause a lawsuit towards you because of something you did from another company that got compromised, and now you're liable. You want to avoid being in those crosshairs.
That's a really good point. It's almost like, because once that happens, it's like a spider web, right? Like down the line, because of your negligence, now you cause someone else to get compromised. Now they have their information. It just keeps going down and down the line. That's a really great point. Hey, Matt, can you tell the audience how to find you? And also, can you talk about MacGyver and MacNerd?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you giving me time for this. So you can find me on a lot of socials. If you go to MacGyverTech.com or MacNerd.io, or our two websites, our socials are listed at the bottom in there. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have a lot of followers in there, and I try to share and help people with cybersecurity needs, or, in general, this, trying to help people out. They might be in a situation. I'm a nerd. I like just sharing good stuff as well. So hopefully you'll follow me there. And you also find me, I have a TikTok, and, I'm also on LinkedIn quite a bit. So I'd love to kind of help anybody that might be having any questions, please fire away and find me on my socials. Also, we've created a cool product called PVA, or Persistent Vulnerability Assessment, and trying to have the hacker's mindset in security penetration and vulnerability assessment, where we're looking at your websites and your infrastructure as the hackers looked at it all of the time. A lot of people kind of fall in the trap, and they'll actually get it, they'll actually do the right thing and get a pen test or kind of see where they are in the security landscape, but they'll do it like once a year. That's not good enough, because the hackers are constantly looking at you all the time to see where your holes are. And you got to be persistent and basically vigilant about that. So we created a cool product in that space to kind of support what we've been doing already. And it's a kind of cool thing. Interested in it. It's actually also driven by some AI, and it's really cool to kind of really automate that kind of area. I really like it. I've actually been involved in the development process myself, even though I'm the CEO, and it's, I think, a really big need. I'm making a security product that's easy to use. That's not easy to do, because most of these things are made for very technical people. I'm trying to make it for a CEO or somebody who's not technical, and they can see their threat landscape really simply and easily. So if you're interested in it, you can go to pva.ai, learn more information about it, or reach out to me. I love to help you and educate you and help make sure you're secure on the internet.
All right, thank you very much. Listen, as of right now, you're a friend of the show, so I know that we didn't touch base on. I think our next episode we have is a blockchain episode.
Oh yeah.
I know you have a lot of experience with that with your company. You guys doing great things with Web 2 and Web 3. So we're gonna have a show dedicated to that because there are like tons of questions and things that I have, and also I think we could have a great discussion on blockchain security. I want to thank you today for your time and taking the time today, and I really enjoyed this cybersecurity conversation. It's some episodes go in different directions, but it's good that in different topics. But when we talk about cyber, what you do and I do, and we could just kind of give some insights. I really enjoyed it. On that note, guys, we are off next week for Labor Day weekend. We may have a rerun of the show, but we will not be live next Friday, September 1st, but we'll be back September 8th with more interesting conversations and so forth. So once again, next week Friday will be the first Friday in a while. We are taking off for the Labor Day weekend, but we will be back the following Friday live every Friday, 12 p.m. EST. To all my people on Instagram, thank you very much for tuning in. Really appreciate you guys. To all the people that hit us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitch, thank you. To the commenters and to Jeff, Sarah, really appreciate everyone. Listen, have a wonderful weekend. Always great. Really appreciate the behind the scenes messages, the comments, everything. Keep tuning into the show. Also, on a small note, we are now starting to put small clips of the show. So we're going to be posting those things out. We just posted our first one this week. We'll be posting more little clips from each episode with some jewels from that 1 to 2 minute clip. So you'll be seeing that on the socials moving forward. Hey, stay behind the scenes and let's touch base. Let me close the show out.
Yeah, actually, before you do, I actually forgot one thing to mention earlier. Is that okay? It's kind of related to security and blockchain. So in September 13th to the 16th, I'll be in Vegas speaking at the Breathe convention about how to not get hacked on the blockchain. So if anybody's interested, we'll have recordings of that as well. And I figured it was a good primer for our next show about blockchain as well. And it's all about secure people on that space as well, which is much more crazier than you can imagine compared to the Web 2 space. So I love, helping people there as well. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
And Mac, for what you're speaking at, feel free after the show, and this is posted, to go in the comments of this episode and put where you're speaking at, any links that you want to put. You can use you can comment on the LinkedIn comment. Well, it's live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We have all the links, but you could put it in the LinkedIn comments.
Absolutely.
If people want to link back to that, not a problem at all. All right, guys. Well, on that note, we are out. You guys take care. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Understanding the technology that powers the money is essential. Knowing the business drivers that inspire how the money is made is crucial. Bridging the gap between the mind of the technologist and the mind of the business is monumental. That is what TBF is all about. Let's start this never-ending conversation. It's time.